Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Bella and I am a seamstress. I've been in one of my usual creative lulls where I don't really have any ideas, I don't have any motivation, I don't want to sew anything, and honestly I don't even want to walk into my sewing room because it's just going to remind me of how unmotivated I've been. So if you're also feeling uninspired right now, this video is for you. I'm going to go over my top 5 tips for when you're feeling uninspired and unmotivated to sew. The first tip I have is probably the most important to me at least, and that is to not sew anything. If you don't feel like sewing right now, it's okay not to. If sewing is your job like it is for me, this might mean taking a few days off between projects. But if you're a hobbyist, this might mean taking a week, a few weeks, even a month off if you want to. Feeling forced to be creative is oftentimes not going to result in very amazing projects that you're proud of. So just wait until you're feeling inspired again and don't try to force it. Take some guilt-free time off because yes, you're allowed to. Tip number 2 might sound a little bit contradicting, but this is all about finding what works for you. So this might mean just sitting down and sewing something. Anything. Sometimes I like to take time off, and sometimes I just get the feeling that if I just sit down and sew something, no matter what it is, God, that scared me. A book fell on my shelf. Sometimes if I just sit down and start sewing, regardless of what the project is, that can kind of get the ball rolling to become inspired again. And another plus is a lot of times when you go into projects not thinking too much about what you want the final result to be, you just sit down and start sewing without a real plan in mind. Sometimes that can result in really, really creative projects that you're really happy with and wouldn't have normally done if you planned it out too much. But if you try this out and you're still not feeling it, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly into the project. And if that's the case, just put it down and come back tomorrow and see how you feel. Tip number 3 is to try something that you've never sewn before or that you don't sew very often. So for example, for me, I tend to lean towards clothing projects when I'm sewing, so sometimes it's really nice to take a break and work on some things for home decor. New pillowcases or curtains are really, really easy projects and just a really great way to freshen up your space, which can also be inspiring. And I find just showing appreciation for textiles in other areas of my life aside from clothing can make me a lot more inspired to get back to my studio and start sewing again. Lately, I've also had a couple really basic quilts on the go. I've yet to actually finish one for myself, but I just keep them going so that I can take a break from whatever project I'm working on if I want to and work on those instead. I find the straight lines of a really basic quilt really satisfying and just something that I don't have to think about too much. And it's also a really amazing way to use up your fabric scraps that you've been accumulating from your past projects. The next thing I do if all else fails is I go fabric shopping. And I say if all else fails because if you're a textile lover like I am, you know how easily fabrics can accumulate in your space and kind of take over your life. So I try to only limit myself to fabrics that I'm actually really inspired to create with, especially if they're brand new from the fabric store, because I do try to mainly buy secondhand fabric. So a lot of times when I don't have any more room for fabric in my life or I don't feel like spending money, just walking around a fabric store can be a really great source of inspiration. I find being in a different environment and looking at textiles can be an amazing way to kind of get my creative juices flowing and think of some new project ideas for fabrics that I have sitting around at home. So I usually come out of the fabric store with quite a few project ideas in mind and usually a long list of fabrics that I fell in love with that I want to come back for. Finally, if you're feeling uninspired to sew right now, maybe you should try giving another creative hobby a go. I like to take up knitting every now and then. Usually once or twice a year I get into it for a few weeks, usually just long enough to remind me that I don't like knitting, I'm not good at it, and I'm way too impatient, and then by the end of about 2 weeks, I'm usually ready to get back to something that I'm actually good at. In all seriousness though, trying out new creative skills is really beneficial because it reminds us how to learn new things and how to fail at new things. And this principle is so useful when it comes to sewing because sewing is just trial and error, trial and error. It requires a lot of failing before you become good at something. So this is just a really great way to remind your brain how to take up new things, and hopefully that will inspire you and give you some confidence when you get back to sewing to maybe add some new skills into your repertoire. And who knows, you might be able to incorporate one of these new skills into your sewing projects in the future. For example, a few years ago, I got really into eco-dyeing fabrics. This just gave me a whole new appreciation for textiles and just fabric construction in general. So if you've been feeling like your projects have been a little bit lackluster lately, maybe it's time you incorporate a new skill. So there you have it. Those are my top 5 tips for when you're feeling unmotivated to sew. I hope this video gave you some insight on how to combat being uninspired and ultimately get back to doing what you love, sewing. If you enjoyed any of these tips, give this video a like down below and subscribe if you want to see more sewing content from me, and I will see you back here next time.